The encounter. Scifi moved silently through the dark human base. The air was cool, and the only sound was the soft hum of machines running in the background. She had never been inside a human camp before. Her people, the Zivar, were warriors. They did not trust humans. Yet here she was, walking among their kind, studying them like a hunter watches its prey. Her sharp golden eyes scanned the area. Most of the human soldiers were inside their tents, sleeping so easily, without fear. It was strange. Her people never slept without guards watching over them. Weakness invited danger. Then she saw something that made her stop. A human lay on the ground, resting against a metal crate. He was not inside a tent, not even under a cover. His head rested on his arm, and his weapons, his tools of survival, were lying unprotected beside him. A long plasma rifle and a sharp combat knife lay within arm's reach, yet he did not hold them. Scifi's breath caught in her throat. This was madness. No warrior, no soldier, no fighter of any species would be so careless. Was he a fool? Or was he so powerful that he feared nothing? She took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the sleeping human. The dim light from the campfire flickered across his face. He was young, strong-built, and his uniform was slightly worn, a sign of experience, not weakness. Scifi frowned. Why would a warrior sleep like this? Her kind, the Zivar, never left their weapons behind. Their blades were part of them, always held close, always ready. The idea of resting without a weapon in hand was impossible. Yet this human, he looked so calm, so at peace. Her sharp eyes moved back to his rifle. She could take it, right now. He wouldn't even wake up. She could lift it, inspect it, maybe even test its weight. If he was truly careless, he wouldn't notice. She stepped forward again, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Closer now, she could hear his breathing. Steady, deep, unbothered. A warrior should always be on guard. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the rifle. And then, "You don't need to do that." Scifi froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The voice was low, calm, but filled with certainty. Her golden eyes snapped to his face. The human's eyes were open. He was awake. He hadn't moved. His posture was still relaxed. But his eyes, they were sharp, aware. He had known. Scifi took a step back, her pulse racing. "You were awake?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. He chuckled softly, sitting up straighter. Of course. His voice was smooth, as if this was a normal conversation, and not a moment where she could have killed him. Scifi clenched her jaw. "Then why did you let me get so close? Why did you leave your weapons unguarded?" The human stretched his arms, yawning slightly, as if he had not a single worry in the world. Then he smirked. "I wanted to see what you'd do." Scifi's hands curled into fists. He was testing her. She had thought he was weak, but now, looking at him, she wasn't so sure. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. Her kind had always said humans were unpredictable. Was this what they meant? She eyed him carefully. "You are either very confident or very foolish." The human grinned. "Can't it be both?" She narrowed her eyes. No, it couldn't. Scifi had faced many warriors in battle. She had seen fear, rage, and desperation. But this human, he was something else. He leaned back against the crate, still watching her. "You thought I was careless," he said. "But here we are. And I still have my weapon. And you still haven't taken it." Scifi hated to admit it, but he was right. She had hesitated. Why? Something about him felt different. Most warriors relied on their weapons to feel safe, but this human, he didn't need to hold his rifle to be dangerous. She exhaled slowly. "You are not like other species, human." He nodded. "You have no idea." The night stretched between them, silent once more. Scifi knew one thing for certain now. This human was not weak. and she wanted to understand why. The alien's curiosity. Sarika stood frozen, her golden eyes locked onto the human who had just spoken. His voice had been calm, too calm, like a predator who had already won the hunt. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how warriors acted. She had expected him to jolt awake, to grab his weapon, to react with fear or anger. But instead, he was watching her, completely relaxed, as if she was nothing more than a passing breeze. Sarika's hand itched near her waist, where her own blade was hidden. The weight of it felt familiar, safe, but she didn't draw it. Not yet. The human, Captain Drake, leaned back against the metal crate, stretching his arms behind his head. His smirk never faded. "Did you find what you were looking for?" His words made her tense. He knew. She had miscalculated. Sarika prided herself on her ability to move unseen, to strike before her enemy even knew she was there. But this human, he had known. And worse, he hadn't even cared. She exhaled slowly, masking her frustration. "I thought you were asleep," she said. Drake chuckled. "I was. But I was also listening." Sarika frowned. "Listening? To what?" Drake tapped his temple lightly. "Everything." Sarika clenched her jaw. He was toying with her, or maybe he was simply stating the truth. She glanced at the plasma rifle still resting beside him. Any other species would have reached for their weapon by now. Why hadn't he? Her curiosity burned hotter. Sarika circled him slowly, her steps light, careful, watching, analyzing. He didn't react. No fear, no tension. That alone made her uneasy. "You are unlike the others," she said finally. Drake raised an eyebrow. "Other humans?" She shook her head. "No. Other warriors." Drake laughed at that, the sound soft, but filled with something deeper, amusement, maybe even arrogance. "Warrior, is that what you think I am?" Sarika narrowed her eyes. "Are you not?" Drake leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with her. "I don't need a weapon to be dangerous. That's the difference between us." Sarika stiffened. That sentence hit harder than it should have. She had spent her entire life believing that strength came from control, from weapons, from being prepared to fight at all times. But this human, he was challenging that belief without even lifting a finger. He let his guard down, on purpose. He left his weapons unattended, on purpose. Why? Her mind raced with possibilities. Could it be that he didn't see her as a threat? Or worse, could it be that he didn't need to? Sarika's hand twitched toward her blade again. Would he flinch if she grabbed it? Would his smirk fade if she pressed steel to his throat? Or would he just sit there, still watching, still waiting? The thought unnerved her more than she cared to admit. She took a slow breath. "Why do you trust so easily?" Drake's smirk grew wider. "Who said I trust you?" Sarika's eyes narrowed. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't foolish. He wasn't weak. Then what was he? She needed to know. "Humans," she muttered, stepping back, "always full of surprises." Drake shrugged. "That's what keeps life interesting, don't you think?" Sarika didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away. But inside, her mind was racing. She had come here thinking she would study humans. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she was the one being studied. A human's confidence. Sarika walked away from the human, her mind storming with thoughts. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been the one tested. She had come close, close enough to take his weapon, close enough to end him. And yet she hadn't. Not because she lacked the skill, not because she feared him, but because something about him was different. Too calm, too sure. She had met many warriors in her lifetime. Brutes, tacticians, killers. But this human, he wasn't like any of them. He was something else, and that unsettled her. Sarika turned sharply and looked back. Drake was still sitting there, He hadn't moved, hadn't adjusted his position, hadn't reached for his weapon. He simply leaned against the crate, watching her with that same infuriatingly confident smirk. It was as if he had never even considered her a danger. Her blood burned at the thought. She was Zivar, a warrior, a trained hunter from birth. And yet, this human sat there as if he had already won a fight that had never happened. She wouldn't let that go unanswered. Serica stepped forward again, moving with purpose. Drake raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He just watched. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" she said, her voice quiet but edged with challenge. Drake exhaled through his nose. Amused. "No, I just think you wouldn't have done it." Serica's eyes darkened. "And what makes you so sure?" Drake tilted his head slightly. "Because you had the chance. And you hesitated." She stiffened. He had noticed. Of course he had. Serica clenched her jaw. "You don't know me, human." Drake grinned. "Maybe not, but I know a killer when I see one. And right now, I don't see one." The words struck deeper than she expected. Serica had killed before. She had fought in battles, taken lives, won wars. And yet, this human, this smug, relaxed human, was telling her that she wasn't a killer. She stepped closer, narrowing the space between them. "And if I wanted to prove you wrong?" Drake didn't even blink. "If you wanted to prove me wrong, you wouldn't have said anything," he answered. "You'd have already done it." Silence. Thick. Heavy. Serica stared at him, her muscles tense. She could strike now. She could draw her blade, move before he could react. But would he react? Or would he just keep watching, keep waiting, as if he had already seen how this would end? Serica's fingers twitched near her waist. Every instinct screamed at her to act, to show him that she was not weak, that she was a warrior, that she wasn't like him. But she didn't. Drake leaned back slightly, his smirk softening, not into mockery, but into something else. Something knowing. "You don't really want to, do you?" he said, voice quiet. Serica hated that he was right. She let out a slow breath and stepped back. "You're arrogant, human." Drake shrugged. "I'm alive." Serica crossed her arms. "And you believe that makes you invincible." Drake shook his head. "No, just prepared." She frowned. "Prepared? You let your weapon lie unguarded. You let me walk right up to you. You should have been dead." Drake's smirk returned. "And yet here we are." Serica hated the way he said that. She hated the way he looked at her, like she was some puzzle he had already solved. Most warriors relied on weapons, strength, numbers. But this human, he relied on something else, something she didn't understand. And that was what truly made him dangerous. For the first time in her life, Serica felt something she had never felt before. Not fear, not anger, but curiosity. She needed to know. What made humans like this? And more importantly, what would it take to break one? The challenge. Serica didn't like this feeling. She had faced creatures twice her size. She had fought in battles where survival was uncertain. She had stood on the edge of death more times than she could count. Yet here she was, standing before a human, feeling something she didn't recognize. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was frustration. Frustration that this man, this Captain Drake, was so sure of himself. Frustration that he had read her so easily. Frustration that, despite everything, she still had no idea what made him so damn calm. Serica folded her arms, watching him. He was still sitting, still relaxed, still wearing that infuriating smirk, like he already knew how this was going to end. "You're too confident, human," she said. Drake raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Serica narrowed her eyes. "You should be dead. Any other species would have killed you in your sleep." Drake chuckled. "And yet you didn't." She hated how easily he threw her own actions back at her. "Perhaps I made a mistake," she said coldly. Drake tilted his head. You sure about that? Sareka clenched her jaw. He was pushing her, testing her. She had spent her entire life proving herself stronger, faster, deadlier. She had never let anyone challenge her without consequence. She took a slow step forward, her hand moving toward her waist where her blade rested. "If I took your knife right now," she said, voice quiet but sharp, "would you stop me?" Drake didn't move, didn't even blink. He just watched her, waiting, as if this moment had already played out in his head. "Go ahead," he said. "Take it." Sareka hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't understand. Why wasn't he reacting? Why wasn't he reaching for his weapon? Why was he still so damn sure of himself? Her fingers curled around the hilt of his combat knife. He didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't show the slightest concern. "Are you truly this careless?" she asked. Drake smiled. "I just know something you don't." Sareka frowned. "And what is that?" Drake leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. "That I don't need a weapon to win." The air between them went still. Sareka felt her grip tighten on the knife, but she didn't pull it away. Something inside her screamed that she should take it, flip it in her hand, test his reflexes, make him react. But another part of her, a quieter, sharper part, was telling her that she had already lost this challenge. Not because she was weaker, not because he was stronger, but because he had never been playing the same game. Sareka exhaled slowly, then released the knife. It clattered against the ground between them. She took a step back. "You are unlike any warrior I have ever met," she admitted. Drake grinned. "Yeah, we humans tend to be full of surprises." Sareka stared at him for a long moment. She had come here expecting to study the humans, to test them, to see what made them different. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was the one being tested. And she had a sinking feeling that Drake already knew how it would end. The warrior's mentality. Sareka's mind was a battlefield. Her people believed strength came from discipline, control, and always being ready for war. To let down your guard, even for a moment, was an invitation to death. And yet, this human had done exactly that. And he was still alive. More than that, he had won without ever fighting. That thought unsettled her. Sareka's golden eyes flicked to the combat knife on the ground. It lay there, untouched, exactly where she had dropped it. Drake hadn't even glanced at it. Most warriors would have reacted by now, shifting their stance, retrieving their weapon, showing some kind of caution. But not this human. He remained still, that calm certainty never leaving his face. She needed to understand. "Why?" she asked suddenly. Drake raised an eyebrow. "Why what?" Sareka stepped closer, her voice steady, but edged with curiosity. "Why do you fight like this?" Drake leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on his knees. "Like what?" She frowned. "Like you don't care. Like you don't need weapons. Like you already know the outcome before it happens." Drake's smirk faded, replaced by something more thoughtful. He studied her for a moment before he spoke. "You ever heard the saying, 'A sword is only as sharp as the hand that wields it'?" Sareka's frown deepened. "No." Drake nodded. "Figures. Most species don't think like that." She crossed her arms. "And what do humans think?" Drake picked up the knife slowly, holding it between his fingers. "A weapon is just a tool. It's not what makes someone dangerous. The real weapon is the mind." Sareka blinked. She had never heard anything like that before. "The mind," she repeated. Drake twirled the knife effortlessly in his grip. "You think I let my guard down? That I was reckless. But tell me, if I had reached for this knife when you grabbed it, what would have happened?" Sareka considered the question. She would have reacted immediately. If he had moved too quickly, she would have assumed he was attacking, and she would have struck first. Her eyes widened slightly. He hadn't reached for it on purpose. Drake saw the realization cross her face and smiled. "See, sometimes, The smartest move is not moving at all. Soraka exhaled slowly, staring at the human in front of her. She had trained her entire life to be the strongest, the fastest, the deadliest. But this man had won without ever lifting a finger. "You don't fear losing your weapons," she murmured. Drake shook his head. "No, because I know I can win without them." Soraka's hands curled into fists. This changed everything. Her kind saw weapons as extensions of themselves. They trained endlessly, perfecting combat techniques, always keeping blades close. They believed power came from control. But this human, he had controlled the entire situation without ever needing control at all. Soraka felt something deep inside her shift. She had thought she came here to test the strength of humans. But now, for the first time, she realized. Maybe she was the one being tested, and she wasn't sure if she had passed the test. Soraka had never felt this before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous. Doubt. For the first time in her life, she was questioning what she had been taught, questioning the way she had lived. Everything in her training, everything in her instincts told her that a warrior's strength came from dominance, from always being in control. But this human, Captain Drake, had never needed control, and that terrified her. She watched him carefully. He still sat there, relaxed, the combat knife twirling between his fingers like it was nothing more than a toy. Most warriors treated their weapons with reverence. This human treated his like a tool, useful, but not necessary. Soraka's pride burned at the thought. She couldn't let this be the end. She had to push him further. She had to know. She had to see if there was a limit to his confidence. Soraka reached out, grabbing the knife from his hands in one swift motion. Drake didn't flinch, didn't tense, didn't react at all. Instead, he simply raised an eyebrow, watching her like she was an animal he had already tamed. That expression made her blood boil. She gripped the knife, flipping it expertly in her hand. The sharp edge gleamed under the campfire's dim glow. "If I wanted to," she said slowly, her voice low, "I could end this right now." Drake leaned back against the crate, tilting his head slightly. "Could you?" Soraka narrowed her eyes. Was he mocking her? She stepped closer, pressing the tip of the blade lightly against his throat. Still, he didn't move. Still, he didn't react. Why? She had expected at least a flicker of tension, some sign that he felt trapped, that he understood the danger he was in. But there was nothing. Nothing but certainty. "You should be afraid," she muttered. Drake exhaled softly, almost amused. "Should I?" The way he said it made her grip tighten around the knife. "I could kill you right now," she said, voice sharper this time. Drake finally smiled. "But you won't." Soraka's jaw clenched. That same confidence, that same calm. "Why are you so sure?" she demanded. Drake's gaze locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. "Because if you were going to, you already would have." Soraka stiffened. She hated how easily he read her, hated how right he was. She had walked straight into his game without even realizing it. She thought she was testing him, but all along he had been testing her. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered the knife. Drake gave her a knowing nod, like he had expected this outcome from the start. She hated that, hated it even more because, deep down, she respected it. Soraka took a step back, tossing the knife at his feet. "You are unlike any warrior I have ever met," she admitted, her voice quieter now. Drake smirked. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Soraka exhaled, crossing her arms. "Humans are reckless." Drake shrugged. "Humans are survivors." The campfire flickered between them, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Soraka still didn't fully understand him. But she knew one thing for certain. This was not over. She would learn more. She would push him further. Because if humans could truly fight like this, if they could win without ever drawing their weapons, Then they were more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Respect earned. Soraka had lost. Not in battle. Not in combat. She had lost in a way she had never known possible. A battle of the mind. Captain Drake had won without lifting a weapon, without raising his voice, without moving an inch. And that unsettled her more than any fight she had ever faced. She stood there, staring at the human, trying to understand how he had turned the entire encounter against her. She had been the one holding the knife. She had been the one with the upper hand. And yet, somehow, she had been the one who backed down. Drake picked up his knife from where she had tossed it, inspecting the blade as if this had been nothing more than a casual conversation. Then, with a practiced flick of his wrist, he sheathed it without a second thought. No tension, no relief. As if he had known this outcome from the start. Soraka hated that. She had been raised to believe that power was everything. That the strongest warriors controlled the battlefield, dictated the fight, dominated their opponents. Drake had done none of those things. And yet, he had been in control the entire time. "You're different," she finally said. The words felt strange coming from her mouth. Drake smirked. "So are you." Soraka narrowed her eyes. "You had no guarantee I wouldn't kill you." Drake exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I had a feeling." "A feeling," she repeated, incredulous. "You bet your life on a feeling." Drake shrugged. "It worked, didn't it?" Soraka's hands curled into fists, but not from anger. From frustration. From respect. From something she didn't fully understand yet. He was right. It had worked. She had hesitated, not because she lacked the skill, but because, somewhere deep inside her, she had already decided not to kill him. And the worst part, Drake had known that before she had. Soraka exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You are reckless." Drake grinned. "And yet, I'm still here." The fire crackled between them, the flickering light casting long shadows on the ground. For the first time, Soraka saw humans in a new light. They weren't like other species. They weren't just warriors, weren't just survivors. They were something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. "You are unpredictable," she muttered. Drake stretched his arms behind his head. "That's what makes us fun." Soraka let out a quiet scoff, but didn't argue. Maybe he was right. She had come here to test the humans, but now she wasn't sure who had been tested more. This wasn't the end. She would learn more. She would study them, challenge them, see just how far their confidence could go. Because if humans truly thought like this, if they could fight without fighting, if they could win without ever drawing their weapons, then perhaps the Xivar had been wrong about them all along. Perhaps humans were not just survivors. Perhaps they were something greater. Drake smirked, watching her expression shift as she processed her thoughts. "You sticking around, or was that enough of a lesson for one night?" he asked. Soraka met his gaze, her golden eyes burning with something new. Curiosity. "No," she said simply. "I think I have more to learn." Drake chuckled. "Then this should be interesting." The fire crackled between them. The night stretched on, and somewhere in the silence, an unlikely respect was formed.